Okay, we're live. Hey, everybody.
Cool.
Thanks for joining us. This is the first installment of the Concrete 5 Dev Roundup. I guess it's what do you call it? A VOD? It's not a podcast, a vodcast.
Vodcast, yeah.
Sure. So we're going to go over some of the things that we do with Concrete 5 when we start out with a new project. And so I'm just going to kind of start running through it. Mike's going to be here with me, and he's going to keep me honest and ask about some things I run into. And if I glaze over stuff, he's going to hold me to it.
Antagonize you.
Yes. So first things first, let me get my things oriented here.
While Korvin's doing that, I'll just remind anyone who's watching, if you have any questions, comments, or anything, you can post that in the town hall channel.
Correct, yes.
Use the wave emoji to indicate that's a question you want to ask, and I'll try to slip that in somewhere.
Yeah, if you can keep an eye on that, I probably won't catch questions. So, yeah. All right. So let's start. I'm going to find out how I can cast my screen. There we go. Okay. Got a little bigger. All right. So there's a few ways that you can get started with using Concrete 5. I think that the most common way that people start out is by just going to concrete5.org and downloading, the zip file. So let me show how one might do that. So if you go to concrete5.org/download, over here, this is always going to have the latest release up in this corner. There's also some information about Composer. We'll get to some of that. But what we'll start out with is this 8.5.1 release, which is currently the latest release of Concrete 5. I typically don't actually go to this page. There's a little known tool that you can use that can let you kind of avoid having to open up your browser and download it. So I like to do this kind of all centralized in my terminal. So the way that you can do that is using an endpoint called latest.zip on concrete5.org. So I'm going to use the wget tool, and I'm going to say wget https www.concrete5.org, and I'm going to say latest.zip. Hit enter. Cool. So it's downloading. You can see it redirected me to a download file link here, and it downloaded this file, called it latest.zip. Okay, that's clear. So now that we've got this, let me get rid of this other training site. So now that we have this latest.zip file, I'm just going to unzip it here. I'm going to make it quiet. Oops. Actually, I'm not going to unzip it here. I'm going to make a directory for it first. So we're going to say make directory and throw me a topic. Give me a noun, Mike. What should we make this about?
Let's call it cats, since that's so popular on the internet.
Cats, okay.
Or kittens, something like that.
So I guess I will unzip in this directory. So let's make that cats directory, and we're going to unzip this quietly just because it has a whole bunch of stuff in it. I want to watch it. So while this is unzipping, the steps that I'm going to take is I'm going to copy this zip stuff into this cats directory. I'm going to set up a web root, and then I'm going to go through the process of installing. So, okay, so you can see our unzip has created this new directory here, Concrete 5 851, which is the latest version, the version we were expecting to get. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go into my cats, and I'm going to move in all that stuff here. Cool. So I apparently have a really fast disk, happened real quick. So now we're ready. We've got a Concrete 5 install just from the latest zip. And let me clear some of this so that we're a little better oriented. We've got some files in here. Namely, the most notable one here is the index.php. So we're just in our cats directory, and our index.php is right at the very top of our project. So what that means is that this is going to be our web root. I use a tool called Valet, so I'm just going to use Valet link, and we're going to call this cats. I'll just call it cats. I'm going to create a new link here, and that has set up this directory as a web root. And to prove that, if I go to my browser, I can now go to cats.test, and we should see a Concrete 5 install screen. And we do. So from here, this is pretty straightforward. It's just a few button presses and all that. I really like to do these things through the command line, though. So I'm going to continue with that trend, and I'm going to install Concrete 5 using the command line tool. If you're not familiar, Concrete 5 ships with a tool that lets you do some helpful stuff like clearing cache, like installing and managing packages, and managing configuration and things like that. It's really a valuable tool. And if you use terminal and command line interface a lot, this is something that you'll find very, very helpful if you use Concrete 5. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do concrete/bin/concrete5. And that's the location of this tool. If I hit enter, it's going to list out some helpful stuff. It's going to tell me what commands I can use. And since Concrete 5 is not installed, all we can really do is install it and get some kind of general information out of it. So we're going to clear again, and I'm going to run that same script, the concrete bin concrete5 script, and I'm going to give it the c5:install command. If I were to just run this, what happens is it tests my setup to make sure that it can install in the first place, but then it gives me some error because it says, hey, you haven't actually told us what settings to use for install. And so what we can do here is we can actually use this interactive flag. We can tell it, hey, just ask me for these things you don't have. So let's do that. c5:install, we're going to give it that interactive flag. Okay, so now you can see it's asking us for the location of our database. And I actually haven't set up my database, so let's get that taken care of. So I just use the root because this computer, I'm not as clean as I should be on this computer, so I'm just going to use root. I'm going to say create database, and we're going to call it cats_training. I don't know if I already have a cats database, so I don't want to have any collisions. Okay, so I'm going to clear again just so that we're at the top. And now we're going to install the same way using that interactive flag. All right, we're back to here. It's asking us for a location of the database server. If you don't know, 127.0.0.1 is just the same thing as localhost. That just tells your computer to connect back to itself. So we're going to tell it it's local. The database name we just set up is cats_training, I think. The username is going to be root. We're going to leave the password blank. All right. So it's going to ask us a bunch of extra stuff here. This is what I typically do. I'm just going to hold enter until it starts giving me errors. It says, hey, you got to give me a password. So I'm going to type a password. Okay, it's not an error anymore, so I'm going to hold enter again. Okay, more errors. It says, warnings detected. Would you like to change the above settings? And it's complaining that my database time zone is not set up to be compatible with my local computer time zone. I'm not too concerned about that for the time being, so I'm going to say no. I would not like to change the above settings, and it's going to give me a review. It says, hey, here's what you told us to set. Username root, database cats_training, and all that business. The one thing that we need to make sure that we take note of is the email address for the admin. By default, if I just hold enter and don't give it an email address, it's going to say your email address for admin is admin@example.com. This really won't come into play unless you change your Concrete 5 site to require email for login. And if you do that, you'll want to know that the admin email is this admin@example.com. Okay, so it's asking me one last time, would you like to install? I'm going to say yes. Okay. So while this installs, this is going to take a second. So while this installs, I want to show one way that you can simplify using the command line tool. So I'm going to open up a new tab here, and we're going to go back into our cats directory. So we've got our cats directory. This is concrete, the index.php we were just looking at. So I can run /concrete/bin/concrete5. If I run that, it still thinks it's not installed because it's currently installing. But you can see I have the command line tool available here and all that. But maybe I don't want to be typing, ./concrete/bin/concrete5 all the time. It'd be nice if there was a tool that could potentially locate this Concrete 5 binary and just run it for us. And thankfully, Mlocati has done most of the work for us on that. All we have to do is copy down what he's given us and make sure that we have it executable. So I'm going to do that. The repository for that is GitHub /concrete5/CLI. This will take us to our Concrete 5 CLI tool. And in here, Mlocati has set up a bash script that will determine the web root. It'll determine the entry point, whether it'll be the Concrete 5 bin or the vendor bin, like it will be in Composer-based Concrete 5. So I'm just going to copy the whole of this. I'm going to go back to my terminal, and I'm just going to put this at user local bin C5. And I'm just pasting that in there. I'm going to save this file. So now, if I run C5, now I got to give it executable permissions. So that's clear. We're going to say chmod +x/user/local/bin/C5. Okay. Now if I type C5, nice. It automatically locates that C5 file. And since our install has completed over here, it's given us a whole bunch more output. But thankfully, I no longer have to run /concrete/vendor/ or whatever it may be. I can just use this Concrete 5 tool to get whatever I need to get out of the command line.
That's a pretty cool tool.
Yeah. So now that we've got this installed, we can go back to our web root here. You remember cats.test was just showing us this install business. But if we go to cats.test now, what we should see is an installed Concrete 5 site ready for us to log in and do stuff. Yeah, so this is kind of just the standard way to get started with Concrete 5. All we've really done is we've downloaded the zip file, we've unzipped it into a web root, and then we've run the install process. So we could, log in here with admin and the password we gave it, and it's going to take a second to log in the first time, but we can log in here and start editing the site if we so choose. So that's great. But this isn't really the process that we at Portland Labs use typically. We don't work from the zip file. We often work from the Composer-based skeleton project. So I want to show how you might how you might get started with the Composer-based skeleton, and then also how you might take this zip-based package that we just installed and kind of update your CLI to use, or rather update your Composer-based site to use the same sort of functionality.
Hey, Korvin, before you do that, maybe could you explain a little bit of what the advantages of using the Composer root would be?
Sure. I think the advantages become more apparent when you're kind of looking at it. The main one for me, other than that, I can manage my dependencies with Composer, and I don't have to manually update those or keep track of them in a separate way than what's standard with Composer. What I really like about the Composer-based model is that it takes those dependencies and it takes them completely out of your web root. And that's valuable because if I have a dependency, say you include a dependency that I wrote, and I made a mistake, and in my dependency, I included some kind of test file that gives somebody maybe too much access if they can access it directly. If I have my dependencies located in my web root, there's the potential for somebody to navigate to a dependency and to access that file. And to demonstrate that a little bit, if we look at our directory here, we've got our index.php here, but parallel to that, we have Concrete, and in Concrete, we've got all of our vendors. So if Guzzle HTTP has something in there that is something that you don't want to be exposing and allowing people to access through your web root, your only two options are to make sure that you disallow any kind of HTTP traffic to this endpoint, or you can use something like the Composer-based Concrete 5, which completely circumvents the issue by keeping those vendor packages outside of the web root. And we'll take a look at that as we get transferred in.
Okay.
Okay. So the way we start with Composer-based Concrete 5 is a little different. We don't use a zip file. we can just use the Composer command line tool to pull this down for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say composer create project, and I'm going to say concrete5 / composer. If you feel like you won't remember this, you can just go to concrete5 composer on GitHub, and down here you can just copy this. And we name it the Oregon Trail here just because we like Oregon, but we can name it whatever we want. So we're going to name it cats _ composer, just so that we can differentiate. So what Composer does when we say composer create project, it's going to go down to that GitHub package that we just looked at, and it's going to pull its whole Git repository down. And then it's going to remove all of the Git stuff that's already in there. And so that we have just kind of a fresh directory to work with that has no Git artifacts or anything like that. That allows us to start our own Git project over top of it. And the last thing that this does is it installs all of the dependencies that we would need to install once you pull down the project. So you'll see here that oh no, I lost track of it now. Oh, here it is. So you can see here that even though we're using the composer-based concrete5, we're still getting 8.5.1, the very latest version. And that's because the skeleton is always kind of set to be using the latest version. Okay, let me clear all this. Now we have a new directory called cats _ composer that has just been made by the composer command line tool. So if we go into cats _ composer, we look at what's in this file, you'll notice that we actually don't have any index.php. We've got all this business, but none of these things are PHP files. None of them are going to handle incoming traffic. What we do have here, though, that you might notice is this vendor directory. So this is the vendor directory that we just looked at that used to be under concrete5. If we say, ls public / concrete, which is the new concrete directory, and try to go into vendor, that file doesn't exist. So those vendor dependencies are never going to be in our public web root. They're always going to be located elsewhere. So to get started with this, we can't just say, set up a web root in the root of our project. We actually have to go into this public directory and set up our web root there. So let's go into public. If we list out stuff, we can see, hey, there's index.php and all the other kind of familiar concrete5 directories. We've got the application directory, concrete, and then packages. So the way that we're going to do this, I use Valet, like I mentioned, so I'm just going to do Valet link. We're going to do cats composer. Now Valet's created a web root here. So now I can go to my browser and I can go to catscomposer.test. And what we'll see is an install. So we're just back at that place we were when we had downloaded the zip and set up the web root. We've just done kind of everything with Composer. Okay, so I don't want to go through the process of installing this. I'm just going to have this site use the database information for the old site. And something interesting about the Composer-based concrete5 is that it comes shipped with this .env.dist file. If you're not familiar with .env format, it's essentially a key equals value format that allows you to store things like credentials or any kind of passwords and configuration that you might want to have outside of your web root and also outside of Git. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first copy that .env. Oops, I need to get out of my public directory because it's not at this level. Let me clear so that we're not looking at so much stuff. Okay, so, oh man, I lost my train of thought. Give me a pickup. Where was I at?
You were going to explain how the .env file works.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
So we have the .env.dist here. So I need to copy this from .env.dist, which is just kind of the sample version of it, to .env. And what that does is it allows concrete5 to start actually consuming it. So if I go into .env now and I use nano to edit, you can see this has our fields for DB username, DB password, and all the other business. And it's also got this concrete5 env equals live. And that's going to be important in a second. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to fill in this information because we've already installed this site. So we're going to say the database username is actually root, and the database or DB database is cats_training, I think. We're going to save this. And now just by filling out that data, if we go back to our browser and refresh, we should see that the site is no longer prompting us to install because it's already installed. And that's what we see.
Nice.
Yeah. So if this was a more fleshed out site with blocks and packages and other things like that, we'd need to copy those things from the old directory to our new directory. But since we just have a blank install here, there's really no value in copying anything over. So I want to show the last thing with .env. I want to show how that concrete5 env equals live ends up coming into play. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this directory in PHP Storm. Patiently wait as it launches. Effectively, what the concrete5_env does is it tells concrete5 which environment to use for configuration files. So if you're not familiar with configuration files with environment, let me show in GitHub. The composer skeleton comes shipping with environment-based configuration files. So if we go into public application config, we can see that the only configuration in here is a file that starts with live dot. And interestingly, if we edit our .env, oops, you can see that that's what we're setting our concrete5 env to. So by setting that concrete5_env, we're telling concrete5, hey, this is the database PHP file you want to load in over the configuration. So if we click into this, you'll see that it's using this getEnv function to get access to those things that we just configured. So by telling it, by creating this .env file and having it being consumed by concrete5 Composer, we're able to access all the things that we set in there. And we're also able to instruct concrete5 to load this environment when trying to load configuration. So we could have things like, live.database and stage.database. We could have, one way that we often use this is we'll have a live.concrete PHP here that disables debug entirely for live. You can't even switch it on. Whereas on stage, we might want debug on, and we might want to be able to see those, error outputs. Yeah.
Hey, Korvin, there's a question here from Chris. If you're running an installation installed this way and a new stable version of concrete5 is released, how do you go about updating that if you're using this method?
If you're using Composer-based concrete5, updating is actually managed entirely with Composer. So I can actually demonstrate that here. So what I'm going to do is say that my composer.lock here has installed an older version. We can see in here that we have 8.5.1 for the version, and the source is here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Composer JSON, and I'm going to say, hey, don't install more than 8.8.2. Install exactly 8.5.0. I'm going to save that. Open the terminal. Actually, I'm not going to use PHP Storm's terminal because that's going to get confusing. I'm going to use my other terminal. Okay. So what we've done is we've gone into our Composer JSON for our project. This still has all the sample stuff that came with the Composer skeleton, but that doesn't really matter because this isn't something we're actually going to share. So what we've done is we've gone in and we've told Composer, hey, when you install concrete5 core, install this version. And that's just so that I can get that older version installed and kind of demonstrate this. Let's do that. Composer update. And what Composer update does is it tells Composer to ignore its lock file, go back to composer.json, and to install what composer.json instructs it to install. So this will hopefully be done here real quick. You can see here that it's reverting from 8.5.1 to 8.5.0. And so, I've now downgraded Concrete 5 Core from 851 to 850. If I were to refresh here, I imagine things will work, but some things probably will break since I installed 851. But imagine that I have a site here, it's on 850. Say my composer is set to install more than 852. If I set that in here, and then I go to, or rather, sorry, more than 850, I set that and go back to Composer and I say only Composer install, it actually doesn't do anything, but it does warn me that the lock file is not up to date. The reason why it doesn't do anything is because when Composer did the update earlier, it stored that version to the lock file. And so it told itself, hey, if you ever need to install again, don't look at Composer JSON, look at this lock file. So, and that's important because that allows you to make sure that the dependencies that you run in your tests are the same ones you have in production. Now that we've actually, set it so that it can use a version higher than what we actually have, and it's even telling us, hey, you're out of date, you should update. We just have to run Composer update. Kind of roundabout way to display this, but we're running Composer update. It's going to say, hey, I can get anything higher than 850. I'm going to get the latest, which is 851. And it's going to update us from 850 to 851. So the last step here, once you run this update, the last step here is to run the command line tool and say C5 update. That runs the update process. So if we had a brand new version here, we should see some information about what's actually being updated, and we should be completely updated to the next version. So just one more time to reiterate, say 852 is released tomorrow. What we'd do is we'd come to our cats composer directory. We would say, hey, there's a new version, and our composer JSON file already tells us we can use whatever's latest. So all we have to do is say composer update, and that would pull down that brand new 852 version, and then lastly that C5 update. So this can, depending on how you look at it, this can greatly reduce the amount of work that you have to do with an update. Definitely, these kinds of things are still sensitive. They need to have backups taken, especially if this is super duper critical infrastructure. When you're updating production, make sure you have a backup just in case if something goes wrong. You can deal with that appropriately. And I did show already, if you did have an issue, how do you downgrade? That's the answer. You would just tell it, hey, don't use more than 850, use exactly the version I need.
So what would be, yeah, Chris said that answers this question. I have a kind of follow-on question. Just as you were saying, if you're going to downgrade there, is there a separate command for the Concrete 5 CLI that you would run, or would you also run C5 update?
No, and you wouldn't want to run C5 update either, because the process for that would be that you had recognized, hey, I'm upgrading critical infrastructure here, and this has the potential to go wrong. So I've taken a database backup. So the flow for that would be like, the site's now broken or something's not acting the way we need. You would revert that database back to the old version that you took a backup of, and then you would just restore the version of Concrete 5 back underneath it. It wouldn't need to do any kind of, process, because ideally your database is going to be, it should just be exactly as it was before the upgrade. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's not any sort of rollback migrations or anything.
No.
Okay.
Nope.
So it seems like this method not only can save some time and lend itself to more automation and add a little bit of security. So is this basically considered the preferred install method nowadays, rather than dropping in the zip file and unzipping it in the web root?
I would say definitely, but it's a matter of perspective. There is value in the zip files structure and the way that we have things structured. That's why we have both options available. The main value that I see with having the zip file is you can just unzip that into a web root. You don't need to have access to the web server to be able to say, hey, point at my public directory instead of something else. And so that zip file becomes, much more simple for a user to approach. You don't have to know what Composer is or touch the command line or anything like that. So definitely, if you feel comfortable using Composer, I would absolutely 100% say this is the way to go. But if you don't feel comfortable, or if you don't have the access to do that sort of stuff, the zip files there, and it's not a bad option. We do, I gave the example of like, if one of these dependencies has a major security issue and that's in your web root, but that, we do try to pay attention to those things and make sure that we aren't releasing zip files that are going to have that kind of issue. So we should be okay on that front. But it is, we do, at least at Portland Labs, we do use the composer-based skeleton almost exclusively. So.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so the next thing that I want to show with this is how you would get a package from Composer, like a Composer-based Concrete 5 package, and install that into your Composer-based Concrete 5.
Let me stop you just a second before you move on to that. Ramon Linders has a question about installing that way. Can you actually still use the in-dashboard update Concrete 5 option when installed with Composer, or does it know that it's Composer installed? Or
it will work, and it'll happily upgrade, and it'll look happy, but you don't want to use it because it's just the standard Concrete 5 upgrade process of downloading the new upgrade zip, unzipping into your updates directory, and then pointing to the new core. So it's a completely different process of pulling down the update. And so, if you have a production site that started off of Composer and you do that update and you never have to, switch out a directory with a new fresh install of it, you might not run into any issues, but you definitely want to use Composer to manage your dependencies, especially Concrete 5, when you're using Composer-based Concrete 5. With our process, when we deploy new sites, what happens is our deploy creates an entirely new web root, essentially, for the new instance of the site, and it runs tests, it does its thing to make sure that we're confident that the site's going to work. So if we were to have run that upgrade process on the previous web root, that upgrade will exist only in that previous web root, and we might run into trouble on the next deploy. So definitely, if you're using Composer-based Concrete 5, avoid that in-dashboard upgrade and make sure to use Composer to manage Concrete 5. That
so
is
you sort of locked into it. Once you've gone down that path, it's difficult to go back.
I'd say so. I imagine, it's not much more difficult than the direct, we just had to download it and then point it at the database. It's not much different for the other direction, but definitely like trying to pull down dependencies, Composer dependencies with non-Composer based Concrete 5 is pretty challenging. So definitely gets you locked in. But
Okay,
I will say that the upgrade through Composer through the dashboard is something we've been looking at. Composer historically hasn't had great plugin abilities, like in terms of pulling in Composer into a third-party thing. They do have support for like plugging into Composer itself, but in terms of saying, I have a HTTP request, it needs to run some Composer dependency upgrades. That doesn't really exist at the moment, but it is something that we've been talking about and looking at for version 9.
Okay, so a follow-on question from Ramon is that if you do install it like for a client, is there a way to disable that update page in the dashboard so they don't accidentally click on it and screw things up?
Sure. I mean, you can just remove the dashboard page if you want to. Typically, in our experience, our clients don't take that initiative. And we don't tell them to do that. They prefer to let us manage the upgrades and to ask us if we can manage it, because then we can deal with the backups. We can handle all the issues if there are any, and that sort of thing. So we haven't done that historically, just because our clients they haven't been the type to go into the dashboard and run those upgrades themselves. So in terms of like what you might do, I think removing permissions to that page would work. I think you can just uninstall the single page. And I bet there's some configuration that you could set to prevent that, but I don't know it off the top of my head beyond those suggestions.
Okay. One more sort of follow on from Chris, going back to what I was asking about before about the preferred method of installing. Is it, if you have a choice between shared hosting and a VPS, is there any difference in whether you'd go the Composer route or the zip file route?
I would go Composer every single time, because okay. I just wouldn't use a web host that wouldn't allow me to use these kinds of things. But so say I have a cPanel host. All I really need is the ability to create a symlink. If I can symlink that public directory to the whatever in cPanel, it's public HTML. I can just remove the existing public HTML and create a symlink from my real public directory to that public HTML, and everything kind of just works okay. So that's the way that I opt to do things. And with the way that we deploy stuff, it really kind of forces us into doing that sort of thing. So I definitely would recommend Composer-based Concrete 5. That's how I do it. I honestly haven't installed from the zip file in quite a long time. The first time I've done it in probably a few years is today for this training. So I opt for the Composer-based. I really like the freedom that gives you and the amount of flexibility with being able to pull in dependencies. So that's my recommendation. But definitely, feel it out and do what's right for you.
So on the shared hosting, you may be limited to the shell access or whatever. You might be stuck with the zip file method. But if you have a VPS, obviously you're going to have access to the shell.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't consider that. There are a lot of cPanel hosts and web hosts that won't give you any kind of CLI access. And if they don't have any file management tools that would let you create that symlink, you're kind of stuck. So that you'd be forced into using that zip file. But, that's why we have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we're caught up on questions now.
Nice. Thank you guys for those. Yeah, so where I was at, I'm going to install a package from Composer, and we're going to do this all in the CLI. So just to reorient, I'm going to go back to catch-composer.test, refresh, and make sure we didn't break that. Seems like everything's happy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell Composer to pull down a package. And the package that I'm going to use is the Brand Central open source package that we've released recently. Because this package is based on a skeleton that we have for Composer packages. So I know that it'll work and it'll be happy. So I'm going to say Composer I'm going to say Composer require, and I'm going to say Concrete 5 / Brand Central. You might say, well, how do you know that that's Concrete 5 / Brand Central? You go to this, there's no README here. Some developer named Korvin probably should have added a README here with that information, but it's not there. So how would you know? One way you can know is just by looking at the composer.json. That's going to be the name field. If you don't remember that, you can just go to packagist.org and search for stuff. So if I search for Brand Central, you should see, Concrete 5 Brand Central. So I can just copy that and say, I already have it there. So Composer require Concrete 5 Brand Central. I hit enter. What Composer is going to do is just the same sort of business. It's going to pull down this Git repository, and it's going to merge all the dependencies that this Composer project has with my dependencies. And so we can see that. We can see that it's installed this version 0.6.3, and it's pulled in its dependencies, Google Protobuf, some Firebase stuff, URI templates, and all this stuff is pulled down, and pulled into that vendor directory. So we could just prove that. We can say ls vendor Google auth. And so now we have that directory outside of our web root, and it's dependencies that this package has. And the last thing I'll show with that, if we go to the actual Brand Central repository, there's no vendor directory here. This package doesn't have any of those vendor files. The only thing that it has relating to those is this composer.json file and this requirement here. Okay. So we've pulled down this package. It says, hey, I've pulled down version 0.6.3, and it says installing, but it hasn't actually installed our package. So if we say ls public / packages, we should see brand _ central. One thing that we do, anytime we pull in a package from Composer, we make sure to add that package to git ignore. And that's because if we're using Composer to manage our package, we definitely don't want to use Git to manage it as well. It's already managed in its own Git repository, and we can just kind of pull that down anytime we need it. So if I say git init in this directory, we can create a new Git repository. And if I say Git status, you'll see there's just a bunch of business here. If I do git add public packages, it adds a bunch of stuff. Git status is what I want. It adds a bunch of stuff, namely the stuff in the brand central package. And like I just said, we don't want that. So I'm going to reset that so that it's not in there. Let's clear so that we don't have all this business. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit my .gitignore. At the bottom, I'm going to say composer packages, and I'm going to put here /public/packages/brand_central. Now if I add, git add my .gitignore, and then I git add public packages, and then run git status, you'll see here that it adds public packages. It's got my gitignore, but nothing from the brand central package. We don't even need to worry about that. Okay. Get this sorted. Let's add everything we have here. Git add dot. See what we have. Git status. Okay. I'm just going to commit this. Initial commit. Okay. That was unnecessary. It's just an example of how we use Composer in addition to Git, and how we manage incoming Composer packages, Composer-based Concrete 5 packages, I should say, when dealing with Git. Okay, so what we've done is we have used Composer to pull down this brand central package. We've used Git to track all of our files, and we've told Git to ignore that package. We'll just use Composer to manage it. The last thing we need to do here is actually install it into our Concrete 5 site. If we go back to catscomposer.test and refresh, it's just what we've been seeing, just a blank site. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that CLI tool to do C5. We're going to say C5 package install. We're going to say brand_central. And it checks all the preconditions for the package. Packages can define their own custom preconditions, and it's going to check that it doesn't have any known incompatibilities, and then it installs it. And this package actually has sample content. So now when we go to our site, that sample content shows up instead. So this is how we manage pulling down our packages, our dependencies. This brand central site that's actually in production, that's exactly how we have it set up. It's a Composer-based Concrete 5 site. It's pulling in this Composer-based package, even though it's pulling in the open source version. And that's how we're managing the process of upgrading this package, deploying to live and all that.
Nice.
Yeah.
I guess one thing, I don't know if you're going to cover this or mention this, but you can also use Composer to bring in packages that you're creating in private repositories as well, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so Packagist is an example of a public Composer repository. There's more than just Packagist, but out of the box, Packagist is the only thing that Composer is aware of. But you can totally give Composer, you can tell it, use a different repository. So for example, there's composer.concrete5.org. This is what's called a SATIS, SATIS repository. This is an open source project made by the Composer team that lets you host these kinds of Composer repositories with your own stuff. So what this Composer repository does is it says, hey, what packages do we have in the marketplace that are free and that are compatible with Composer? And what it does is it exposes all those free packages to be installed with this C5 market namespace. So one thing that we pull down a lot would be the reCAPTCHA, EC reCAPTCHA. That's in here. So I'll just demonstrate how you might do this. So what we'll do is we'll copy this because we need to be able to tell Composer that it can look here. So we'll copy this. We'll go back to our terminal. We're going to edit. I guess we have PHP Storm open. So let's use PHP Storm to edit this file. At PHP Storm composer.json. So I'm just going to add this here at the bottom and fix the spacing on it. Yes. Oh, we're indexing. That's why my highlighting is weird. Yeah, so we've added this repository to our composer.json. So now anytime we do Composer update or Composer require, oh, why? Oh, I see. It needs to be at the current level and not in that wrapped bracket. So like I was saying, anytime we run composer update or composer require, it's now going to review this composer repository as well as that packagist repository. And so anything that's listed here can now be installed. So just to demonstrate that, if I copy this, I can say composer require C5 market EC reCAPTCHA. And assuming everything has worked, yeah, it pulls down 1.1, which we can see is, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I see. Using version more than 1.1, but it pulls down 1.1.1, which is the latest version. Now we can do that same thing, C5 install EC underscore reCAPTCHA. That's actually C5 colon package colon install. And we got our package installed. Yeah. So that's an example of how you might use a separate composer repository. We actually have other status repositories that link to our completely private Bitbucket repositories that you wouldn't be able to access. But since we have that repository and since my computer has access to download those things, it's able to pull those repositories in.
Cool. Ramon is asking a detail about installing the Brand Central package. Wait just a second for clarification here. What he wrote is the Brand Central doesn't work if you, the question is, would it work if you just drop it into /packages without Composer, since you wouldn't have the vendor files if you do a Composer within the packages /Brand Central, it will not load them?
Yeah, that's correct. So
basically, the Brand Central package requires Composer to be set up. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, right now, if we look at the Brand Central packages controller.php, what we'll see in here is that it doesn't make any effort to load in anything about Composer. We don't see any kind of auto loading or, if I type in auto load, I guess we do have auto loader in entries, but we're not loading in the Composer auto loader. So this package is essentially passively expecting that you have included it with Composer. Now, that's not the truth for every package. Potentially, what you could do is in your on start, you could say, hey, is this class available? Say, like, does this class exist? And what PHP would do is try to auto load it and say, hey, I don't see that class. It's not set up to auto load. And that would tip you off that you hadn't been included with Composer. And then from there, you could maybe include a local Composer directory. I just wouldn't do that. And the reason why is firstly, because we have our dependency listed as Concrete 5 core and version 8.5. So what this tells Composer is if I'm loading this into a Composer-based Concrete 5 site and that Composer-based Concrete 5 site has an earlier Concrete 5 version, it won't let you install the package. But what that means is that if I actually go into my public packages Brand Central directory and I run Composer install, what's going to happen is it's going to pull down all of Concrete 5, a full copy, and all of Concrete 5's dependencies, all of my dependencies. And so now, like all these guzzle things that really don't have anything to do with my package, it's just part of Concrete 5. I've now duplicated all that stuff. And when I do load my Composer auto load, I'm going to actually replace all of the auto loading that Concrete 5 is doing potentially. So it's not ideal. Definitely, if you're using Composer in a package, you want those dependencies to flow out to the main, the root Composer JSON, so that your vendor is completely outside of the web root, and so that Composer can make sure to only pull down one copy of each of your dependencies. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, Ramon said that that confirms what he was thinking.
Yeah.
Chris wanted a little bit more detail on, we mentioned sort of the advantages of using Composer and why that makes it sort of the preferred install method, but he's wondering, he's convinced now, he's wondering if there are any sort of disadvantages to using Composer. We talked about being sort of locked into it in a way
Mhm.
once you use it. Are there any other potential disadvantages?
I'd say the updating is a example of a disadvantage. I think if you have a junior developer that isn't aware of Composer and they pull down this repository, it might be really confusing on a first approach. But Composer's been around for 10 plus years and it's pretty ubiquitous across projects these days. I don't think we have a competitor that doesn't use it. So as long as you um, as long as you're just kind of using the skeletons that are provided, um, I find that we don't ever run into any kind of negative, even with the updating thing. But as I said, our clients aren't the type to be going through the dashboard and messing with stuff. So I think we've really covered everything that I would say is a negative. So the updating, you mentioned like the potential for lock-in, and then lastly, the fact that packages, if they have those Composer dependencies, have to be kind of included with Composer. You can't really install them from the store.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, as someone who has a lot less experience than Corvin, I can attest to what he said, that it is a little confusing at the beginning, but learning how to use Composer, what Composer is something any junior dev is going to need, just like Git and any other sort of basic tool in your toolkit. So yeah, once you can get over that little learning curve, the benefits really outweigh the disadvantages. Ramon was following up with one more question about the marketplace packages. He wrote, we've been dumping them with the packages since you cannot suppose each buyer of the marketplace will run with Composer after buying and installing. So how, I guess, let's see, I know one main vendor is nice, but the marketplace. Yeah, so basically how do you deal with marketplace packages? Because they're not going to be Composer based then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have not had to deal with this. We don't really have many paid packages in the marketplace, and especially the ones that we do have, we're marking them as legacy and trying to maintain them as little as possible. So I don't have too much experience with selling packages that will need to be pulled in with Composer, but I can tell you that we use we use packages that really anybody could try to download, and our status Composer repositories even are public. Anybody can access them and see what packages we have available. But because we have our packages as private, you can't actually download them and install them with Composer unless we give you access to in Bitbucket. And so I've done a lot of thinking on this, and I think that's the direction I would go. It's, given our circumstance today, it's a little challenging to think, hey, I'm going to sell my version of my package, and then I'm going to go and then give them somehow access to a repository and communicate that to them. There's not really a great way to do that today, but that is totally an option. If people really want to install with Composer, you can just give them access to the repository, and they'll be able to use that happily without you having to release your package for free. Alternatively, and this is how I would probably do it, I would keep the Composer version of the package kind of open source and free, but I'm kind of an open source hippie. I would keep it open source and free, and then leave the marketplace sales as a venue for people to buy support and access to my help with setting up or dealing with issues. So I think those are the two ways that we really have available to approach it if you're trying to work within the concrete5.org marketplace. But like I said, we've been looking at ways to make this better with version 9. And as you guys know, we have some work slated for concrete5.org that hopefully we'll get to sometime soon. And with that, I think this is stuff that we'll be thinking about pretty hard.
Okay, so it sounds like if you were to install Concrete 5 using Composer, and you needed to get an add-on from the marketplace that you needed to purchase, there's not going to be a huge barrier to just installing that through Concrete 5, right?
Yeah, that's correct. You can, so yes and no. So I say yes initially because you absolutely can go the same way you can go into your dashboard and hit upgrade. You can go into your dashboard and install a package from Git, or rather, sorry, you can install a package from the concrete5.org marketplace, and that'll work great. But the challenge with that is just installing a package from the marketplace doesn't necessarily pull that package into your Git repository or into whatever kind of version control you're using. And so you run into that same issue of like, hey, I went into production and I installed this package, but then I downloaded the project and tried to work on it and the package is missing. Or I ran a new deployment and because that package was installed from the marketplace, now we're hitting errors because the package no longer exists. And so what I'll say to that is when you do purchase install packages from the concrete5.org marketplace, just make sure to do that in a place where you can add that package to Git and commit it up. You can still go through the same processes of upgrading the package. You just want to make sure that you're, at least for us, also managing that in your version control repository so that you can have that available for development and for all the different cases I mentioned.
Okay, great. I think since we're kind of running out of time here, I just wanted to ask one last one that we probably should have talked about near the beginning, because I don't know if people who are more beginners would make it to the end of the video for this question, but there is one other option for installing Concrete 5, which is relatively popular, but perhaps a bit more limiting, and that's using Softaculous. I was wondering if you had any comments on that, how that might be advantageous or limitations, disadvantages, things like that.
Using integrated installers like Softaculous is a very approachable way to getting started. You don't have to worry about, what's a web root, what's a zip file, like how do I get this unzipped? It's very approachable for essentially anybody who needs to get a website. And so it's very, very, very nice to have because people who are just a mom and pop business that need to get a website going, they can go to this interface and with a couple clicks, they can have a web root that has a installed version of Concrete 5 that they can begin working on. And so it gets rid of all this business of like, how am I going to manage changes? How am I going to track things like version control and dependencies? I don't think those are questions that these people really have or need to have. So I think that I would say really serves that kind of crowd of people who just don't want to manage any of it. What I will say is those tools do a pretty good job of installing just kind of a standard install that you could migrate from one hosting account to another. So I wouldn't say that there's any real negative to using that, at least not that I have seen, over using something like just this unzip method. But I definitely would still recommend going with Composer. It's definitely what I use. But I did write it. And so there's some bias there.
A little bias.
Yeah. Well, so for next week, we'd love some input on what you guys would like to see. Some things that I wanted to go over that I didn't get a chance to. Composer-based Concrete 5 comes with what's called Laravel Mix, a tool that helps you compile CSS and JavaScript files. And there's some really cool complex stuff you can do with that just with minimal work. So I'd like to show that in an episode. There's also the ability to begin working on a brand new Composer package from the sample Composer package repository. That can be a little confusing, and I wanted to show some of how you would get started with that. So that's another example. But this was a little high level. We might be able to cover some lower level topics like, what are blocks? How do you use them? And how deeply can you integrate with them and things like that. So any ideas with what you guys would like to see and, the tone of the show, the direction, definitely feel free to share those with us and we'll take them into consideration. I believe, let me open up my calendar. And would have been nice to have a calendar open. Okay, so it looks like the next episode is going to be the 9th of May. At least that's planned today, tentative. Keep an eye on our blog keep an eye on our YouTube channel. You should see a scheduled event or a blog post come out a week or so before, and keep an eye on that. Definitely let us know if you have ideas, and give us praise if you liked it, and if you didn't like it, maybe don't tell us. And thanks for watching.
You can tell us. You can tell us. We'll try to improve.
Tell Mike, don't tell me.
Yeah, you can tell me. We'll definitely put out a blog post in advance. And what we'll also try to do is chop these up a little bit, and I can see making 3 short videos of the 3 different ways to install Composer out of this, and try to use this also to keep the online documentation updated. I know if you actually read the install.md and the readme.md, there's 2 different ways of installing Concrete 5 documented there, and perhaps people don't read those anymore. But yeah, we're going to try to use these sessions as motivation to keep everything up to date and fresh. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you guys. See you next time.
Take care. Bye-bye.